get knocked down, but you gotta get up. Keep going.
All right, everyone, welcome to the Sovereign CEO podcast. I have with me today my friend Omar Sheikh. Sheikh, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Carla. It's a pleasure to be here on your podcast.
I'm going to redo that because now I got in my head again. All right, everyone, welcome to the Sovereign CEO podcast. I'm Carla Treadway, and I have with me my friend Omar Sheikh. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Carla. Pleasure to be here.
So we just met at the Reclaiming Canada conference. You had generously helped with some of the legal for the event, but you were also a key speaker. And I thought it was just really important to bring you on the show. I just really appreciated your very level-headed approach to the things, the big problems that we're dealing with right now. And really just like your way with people. There's a real gentleness to you, and this is why I wanted to bring you on and have a conversation with you today.
Well, thanks, Carla, and I really appreciate being here. You know, I don't do a lot of these, but when I met you and I saw the amount of work that you put into the conference, I thought this was the right thing to do, and so I'm honored to be here, and I feel likewise about you in terms of how you conducted yourself and all of the work behind the scenes that you were doing to get that conference together. I don't think people will ever know how much work that was, but I know as an insider, it was a lot. So thank you for that.
It was definitely a bit of a roller coaster. It ended up turning out really beautiful. It was a great event, but you're right, the back end we were running in preparation for this thing.
Yeah, and even the details. I mean, there were little gift bags for speakers, and everyone really felt appreciated. I think a lot of time people don't get how much it goes into those little details when you're putting out an event like this. And I had attended the Reclaiming Canada conference the year prior when it was a much smaller, different feel event, and this was night and day larger, much more professionally put together. Not knocking the old one, but certainly I saw the evolution with your hand involved. So that was really good.
So for people that listen to the show that maybe aren't familiar with you and your work, can you tell us a little bit about your law firm and the kind of work that you've been doing the last few years?
Yeah, sure. So my firm was started to try and help as many people as possible with COVID related litigation. That was our first kind of foray into the files. I was working at a firm prior to that, and during the actual vaccine mandates, when they started coming out, there was a great deal of people calling employment lawyers all around the country trying to find help. They were about to be fired or they had been fired. And these were seismic events in people's lives. You know, there's this quote that talks about and it's not a sexist quote, but it says taking a man's job away is akin to killing him.
Mm.
And it's very, very true. People are tied to the purpose, their job, their identity, their financial freedom, everything is tied to it. And so there was lots of calls coming in. And I remember I started getting those calls. And initially, even I had shied away from taking on those cases. I had just done this very complex flu vaccine case while I was the CEO of the BC Nurses Union. And I didn't really want to get back into that world. But I decided I'd take these calls. And then very quickly, these clients in their desperation conveyed to me what was happening to them. I felt horrible as a Canadian, as someone who had a voice to hear that you're losing your home, you're losing your job, all because you didn't want to take a vaccine, which at the time and still is unproven, didn't prevent transmission of COVID-19, which is the key to any definition of vaccination. And so it didn't make sense. And so I took on those clients at that firm, and very quickly the people in the firm became very uncomfortable. And so it was, well, you can bring these clients into the office, but maybe bring them in after hours, or maybe meet with them off site. This whole stigma that these unvaccinated, dirty people were going to somehow cause the end of that practice. And so I had quit, and I said, well, I'm not going to do any of that. I quit. I took those clients with me, and almost overnight started up my own law firm, just doing that. And one of the first things that we saw as a firm, as more and more of these clients started calling, we had healthcare workers, public service workers, aviation workers, federal workers, pretty much every industry around this country. We started noticing that that there were a lot of incorrect legal advice being given. There was a lot of incorrect legal advice being given, and people were paying a lot of money that they didn't have to a lot of different lawyers, which I'm not going to name any of them, but they were paying money to different lawyers for things that didn't make sense to us, right? When we look at an individual who's been fired, whose wife has also been fired, or his husband has also been fired, and they have children, this is seismic. They don't have the money it takes to pay lawyers. And so there was this palpable depression and desperation within these client groups. And just based on my own previous experience, I knew that I couldn't represent them unless we found a way to stabilize these folks first. They were in a spiral, their depression was getting stronger, some were living out of their car, and it just wasn't going to work, right? You can't represent a client in that state. It's very difficult. And then quickly we started hearing about suicides that were occurring in some of these groups that we were dealing with, which were just tragic. And I got those phone calls on, so and so from this group died, or so and so from that group died. And so we created something called the Karmic Retainer, which was the first of its kind. I don't know technically. I think it's allowed, and the Law Society's certainly seen it now. But at the time, no one had done it before. And the retainer said, okay, you're going to organize into your groups. So whether that's healthcare or public service or aviation or any other group, federal groups, you're going to organize. And before we agree to represent you, any money that you do have or that you fundraise from external sources first has to go to you. Meaning that the groups had to create a hardship fund, and then pay for things like each other's groceries, rent, kids' birthday gifts, things that are really important that would cause a lot of depression and anxiety, because unemployment had denied these guys. They weren't getting EI insurance. For the most part, their credit had been shot by the time they're in these groups because they can't afford to pay their bills. And so we knew we needed that element in there. And then the other thing we added was psychological services. Because we had healthcare professionals in a lot of our groups who had been terminated, we said, okay, now I want you to donate your time to host meetings and groups and other things to help people with their psychological health. So we created that hardship fund basis. And we said, once you've done that, and anybody who puts in a claim has gotten money from you out of that hardship fund and all that, then if you have money left over, you can pay the firm. And if you don't pay the firm, that's okay. We're going to continue to represent you. And so we did that model, and everyone thought I was absolutely insane for doing it, because they said, well, you're going to start a new business. There's no guaranteed income. And the income that is coming in through the fundraising, you're not even taking. You're saying pay it to yourselves. But I knew it was the right thing to do, because there were other groups that were paying hundreds of thousands of dollars they didn't have for legal work that wasn't going anywhere. And there was so much fundraising going on in that time, whether it was the convoy, and I'm not, again, there's no commentary on the validity of that fundraising, but there was a lot of fundraising happening. And I knew that we just couldn't do that in this scenario. So we did that. We quickly ended up with about 25,000 clients in these various groups around the country. And the group started competing with each other of who was giving more to the hardship fund and who had paid out more claims, which always warms my heart. And I would get to hear about that from their group leaders. And then we started filing cases, right? We wanted to understand to what extent, the charter applied or the union issues applied, and how we were going to move these cases forward. And we developed some really novel arguments that nobody else had used and done. And so we're in those cases now. We've got 5 class actions around the country that are currently in various stages. And we've got a crap load of individual cases that are in various stages, and we're just proceeding on. Luckily, some of the groups were able to fundraise and others haven't been able to fundraise, and that's okay. There's never a pressure from the firm that says, well, if you don't pay the bill, you're gone and we no longer represent you. The goal here was to stabilize them, which I think we did. I think it helped some people. I hope it did. And yeah, and so that's how this firm started growing. And then we started getting other clients too. And you know, I hired assistants and you know, another lawyer, Angela Wood, came on into the firm. She was great. And we had this gentleman named Philip Davidson, who was a former government employee. He was amazing at helping the firm build initially. And a lot of people really donated a lot of time to. And so we're still in that. We're continuing to grow and take on new challenges. And you know, now we're the only firm and the first firm in North America that launched litigation against Pfizer. You know, we quickly discovered that what everyone told us was impossible wasn't, right? So it was supposed to be impossible to sue Pfizer, right? There was this immunity agreement. They couldn't do it. Well, you know, I challenged people on that. I kept hearing that. And I said, okay, well, show me the agreement. No one could produce it, right? All you could show me was this US legislation in the States that said that, but nothing in Canada. And eventually I figured out it doesn't exist in Canada. And that was another one of the misconceptions out there. And so we took on some very tragic cases of people who have been killed by the vaccine, children. And we launched suit against biotech in Germany and Pfizer in New York and Pfizer in Canada. And, you know, we're currently in process of doing that. And again, it's the same deal, right? I mean, a lot of these folks are trying to fundraise, but we're not going anywhere. You know, whether they raise the funds or not, we're going to continue on doing our work. So that's the philosophy of the firm. It's always been, you know, how do we help the most amount of people? And yeah, I mean, it's all been, a lot of it's been COVID based, but it's starting to shift a bit into, I'd say, a lot more regular law and files coming in, which are always welcome, and we're happy to take them. But certainly the freedom issues have been important to us. I mean, we don't consider ourselves a firm in the freedom movement just because we don't know what that means anymore.
Yeah.
But we certainly, you know, we fight for free speech. We're free speech absolutists. We're constitutional absolutists. We will fight any of those cases. We're significantly invested into parental rights, and we'll take cases against school boards and schools and trustees and others that would interfere with that. So we have our own kind of moral compass, and we take cases consistent with that.
Was there a moment where you decided, like, I have to be involved in this movement?
Yeah, it's a story on that. So I was working at that other firm. I was getting these calls, you know, from various people, and I wasn't taking the files, right? They were calling every employment lawyer. It wasn't me. They were calling everyone they could. And at the time, I had just left being the CEO of the nurses union, and before that, their general counsel, and took that union through COVID, right? So I was involved in all of the minister calls, the public health call. Like it was very, very busy time. And I was the only union at the time fighting government. When we were all supposed to be in this together, I was like, no, we're not, right? Like there are issues here and we got to deal with them. And so I was pretty exhausted, and I thought, you know, I'm just going to have this practice that's normal and small and, you know, more of a community-based legal practice, not massive constitutional challenges or suing drug companies. And so I wasn't taking the calls. And then my son, you know, who I talk about quite a lot in any of my public comments, my son decided he wanted these new sneakers, and they were downtown Victoria. Downtown Victoria is a pretty quaint, small place. And this was around the same time that we started seeing all of these protests with the Canadian flag, and people were out there demanding their rights and arguing against government mandates. And so it was really in the thick of it. The trucker convoy had just happened, and yet all of these offshoot protests were still happening. So I'm walking with him down this street in downtown Victoria, which is fairly small, and there's this couple an older couple, who were carrying a Canadian flag on their way to the legislature. to protest, right? And all of a sudden, you see kind of this little mob form around this couple and start accosting them, right? Like, you know, you people are crazy. What the hell are you protesting? All the stuff you heard in the trucker convoy. And so I'm standing there with my kid, and I look at him and I say, I gotta go say something, right? Because part of the questions they're shouting at these people is, what rights have been violated? Which one of your rights has been violated? That was the normal thing for the anti-movement to shout. And so my kid looks at me and he's like, don't do it, right? Like, we're in public. You
Just
know,
want
I
my
just want it.
sneakers.
Yeah, I just want my sneakers. Like, don't do it. And so I literally put him to the side. I said, I gotta go. So I went and walked in the middle of the crowd. I stood next to those folks, and then I rattled off all of the charter rights that I say were violated, right? And so I said, well, what about Section 7 of the charter? And what about Section 15? And what about 2A? And what about freedom of assembly? And all of those things. And obviously the person leading the charge was kind of stunned that here's this person articulating something back to them in a pretty forceful way. And so the guy looks at me, the mob is fairly quiet at the time. And the guy looks at me, and my son's there, and then he goes, well, you're a white supremacist. And I swear to God, at that time, my mind was blown. Like, I'm usually not at a loss for words, but I was like, holy crap. Like, for a minute, you think to yourself, am I a white supremacist? Like, my name's Omar Sheikh, right? Like, you know, I'm a brown guy, for those of you who are just listening in the audio. You know, I'm visibly brown. And so you go, there's something really wrong with this narrative when
Yeah.
I'm being told. And the couple, by the way, the older couple that was carrying the flag, they were Portuguese. And so we're being accused of being these white supremacists, or whatever the narrative that this people had believed. And so, you know, my son looks at me, and he's almost cracking up, you know, saying, are we white supremacists? And I'm just like, no, we're not white supremacists. And then, you know, we walked away from that. The couple got to go away, and they got to go to their protest, and this little mob dispersed. Remember, this is a Victoria mob. This is not New York or Toronto. These are fairly Gentile people anyway. So I remember leaving that afternoon after finishing up our shopping, and I was like, yeah, I got to get involved. Like, something's really wrong here. And I had done it, right? Like, I had done the flu stuff and the vaccine stuff, and I had some familiarity, and certainly I had spent the last 10 years fighting governments in my old job. So I had some understanding. So that's when I decided, yeah, it's time to get involved and move from there.
This is the thing. Yeah. I was a little slow out of the gates myself, not really seeing that there was a problem. I saw a lot of my friends not wanting to take it, and I kind of thought they were crazy in the beginning. I
Mm-hmm.
didn't think it was a big deal. And I had two moments. One, it was when my daughters came home from school and said the health unit was there saying that they could get a shot without permission. And I thought, that's strange because I've signed about 15 permission slips this year for everything from can they take a walk around the block to can they be fed at school. But an injection, no problem. That was the first one. And the second was one of the COVID doctors, one of the doctors that was at the convoy, stayed at my in law's bed and breakfast. And he said, never put this in your body. And he gave me a whole protocol and prescription list, including ivermectin and some antibiotics. He's like, if you get sick and it's bad, he's like, take this. And I thought, this is the world's most deadly pandemic, and they're giving people nothing if they get sick. So the preventative is one thing, but what happens when you actually get sick? And after that, just everything unraveled for me about this, and I knew it was something so much bigger than what they were telling us.
Well, it was the elimination of choice, right? So I never professed to be a scientist or someone who studied the way vaccines work. Like, it didn't, none of that mattered to me. What
Hmm.
mattered to me was your right to make the decision.
Hmm.
Um, especially for your children and for yourself, it's your body, your health, right? Remember the whole thing in the States, and the whole liberal movement, my body, my choice, right? I mean, that has been ingrained forever. And so you go, okay, well, doesn't that apply in these circumstances, and there are limits, right? So, if it's something that if you don't take, you're going to end up hurting somebody else, or killing your neighbor or killing grandma. Sure,
Hmm.
I think that mandates have a role to play, but when it doesn't do any of that, it doesn't actually prevent transmission. Grandma still gets COVID from you. She doesn't know it yet, but she got it.
Hmm.
Then again, it has to come down to personal responsibility and personal choice. And where does the state all of a sudden come in and say, well, despite the fact that you're not hurting anybody else, you no longer have a choice, right? And I think that's where really drew the line for me. I mean,
Hmm.
again, I don't think this product works. I don't think it meets the definition of a vaccine. But if somebody wants to go and get 15 shots in their eyeball, then that's up to you, right? Go and do. I'm not
Hmm.
going to stop you. I'm not going to protest you. You go and line up and get as many shots as you feel like, as long as you respect the same right on the other side,
Hmm.
which is if somebody doesn't want to get it, then they shouldn't have to get it. And we shouldn't be destroying their lives and taking away their careers and their homes and their reputations and their friend groups and everything else that comes with that because you didn't get the shot.
Hmm.
Makes
100%.
it makes no sense.
So were you having, I know you can't speak to the details of particular cases, but were you having luck? Because on this end, of course, media wasn't telling us anything about that. From this end, everything that I was seeing from the media was it was a dead end. Or I was seeing media coverage of different cases, but it looked very unfavorable. Dads were losing custody to their children, for example, and those were the only kind of cases that media covered. So is it something that you're able to fight successfully?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, so far, none of our cases have concluded.
Mm.
We saw the same coverage. We know of those cases. I think that there is a spectrum when it comes to the judiciary, right? So let me back up and give an analogy. So in the 1700s, maybe the 1800s, but right around there, olden times, there's a gentleman named Dred Scott, and Dred Scott is a black man living in the United States of America with the same constitution they have today. That constitution was in place, of course, then as well. And Dred Scott goes to the Supreme Court of the US and says, I deserve equal rights under the Constitution. I deserve to be recognized as a full person, right? Not three quarters or whatever at the time the thinking was. And the Supreme Court, looking at that same Constitution, says, no, you don't. We don't think these rights are in the Constitution for you because you're black, and off you go. Right now, let's say it's in the 1800s. Well, it was 1963 or something like that when Brown versus Board of Education, looking at the same Constitution, ended segregation in schools. It was 1920 or 30 when they started passing the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution that allowed for equal rights to come in. The civil rights movement went through the 50s and the 60s. The Constitution never changed, right? But judicial decision making changed based on the same facts. So very much the law or the decisions on the interpretation of the law is a reflection of the society, and it's a reflection of the times. And so when we started in COVID litigation, when you talk about those family law cases, a lot of that was very early on. There was a palpable fear that was instilled in the population. And remember, the judges aren't immune to that. They're human beings.
Hmm.
They watch the media. They know, they think they know what's going on as well, and they're as afraid. And so initially, the courts were taking something called judicial notice, which essentially means you don't really get to present evidence on it. So, for example, if I come into court and I say the sky is blue, I don't need to call a witness to say the sky is blue. The court will take notice of that. Obviously, if I say something that dumb, I'd be laughed at. But regardless, that's a concept of judicial notice. These are commonly known facts that you don't need to prove. And then the court moves on. Well, the court was taking judicial notice of COVID and Health Canada and everything, the regulatory scheme that had approved the vaccines. And so the courts in those cases went back and said, well, they're Health Canada approved. We're going to take notice of that. And so based on that, you're going to lose this custodial right, or the mother or the father will have the right to make the decisions, whoever's making this petition. And that was significant. And then you saw a little bit more time pass, and you started seeing courts saying, okay, well, listen, let's hear the evidence. Or maybe this becomes a tribal issue. And so we started moving further away from judicial notice. We developed a standard roughly that was a humility standard. It's not a real thing in the law, but essentially the courts were saying, we have to be humble in the face of reviewing public health decisions because they're the experts, right? So even that's a higher standard, not as much as judicial notice, but you see the spectrum shifting. And then you get to a spectrum where the court says, okay, let us hear the evidence. Let's see exactly what you're talking about. Let's get some scientific evidence in there. And then maybe you can make that shift. But the reality is it takes years, right? Like the Supreme Court of Canada fired employees who were unvaccinated.
Right.
The federal courts released a statement saying all of our judges are vaccinated. And so, you're in this uphill battle of what people believe. And if you go in and say to somebody who's vaccinated, and this is not a commentary on the judiciary, but if you go in and say to somebody who's vaccinated, oh my God, this thing is so horrible, people are going to die, and that person hasn't had any reactions or anything happened to them or their family, and they're sitting there thinking, well, you're a little out there, aren't you?
Mm-hmm.
And that was the discourse, right? The discourse where people came out of COVID. There was these crazy people that all of a sudden came out of their house and were like, it's the government. And neighbors versus neighbors were like, wait a minute, these people have lost it, right? So I think it takes time. We haven't seen any decisions. We haven't seen anything positive. We've seen some arbitration decisions, which are union decisions that have been a bit more positive, that have found some of these policies unreasonable, but nothing in the courts. New Zealand, we have seen in their courts good decisions that on this. We've seen the US now issue a number of decisions that go against mandates, and other countries, but nothing in Canada as of yet. And I don't know if it will come, right? I mean, we never guarantee an outcome. We do our best to make the argument, but the courts could rule against us, and that's something we'd have to accept.
It's funny, in a world that's obsessed with talking about privilege, I think that is maybe a little bit of the trap that Canada sits in. We have this Western privilege, this Canadian privilege. Well, nothing bad happens here. I don't even need to look at that because conspiracies wouldn't happen in Canada. We can trust our government. We can trust our media. I think perhaps that's why Canadians are a little slower to wake up to the reality that there might be something bad happening behind the scenes.
Yeah, I mean, we're a fairly docile population to begin with. But I mean,
Hmm.
Canada has been known for its politeness
And their sorries.
and their sorries
Yeah.
and all of that. And I think, it's a testing ground. And I don't want to go too far into conspiracy theories, but a lot of the stuff we see coming into Canada, like the Online Harms Act, which we can get into, but various pieces of legislation, or how the trucker convoy was handled, how banks froze money, how donations or people who donated got their accounts frozen. A lot of this is really out there totalitarian behavior. And yet, if that same stuff happened in the States, you would see riots on the streets. You didn't see that here. You saw a very peaceful trucker convoy protest. It wasn't painted that way,
Hmm.
but it was certainly anybody on the ground or getting real video from on the ground would see that there was a multi-ethnic, multicultural group of people who had come together in a peaceful way to try and raise awareness for what was happening. But look at how they were treated at the end. So I think a lot
Hmm.
of that is Canadians are apathetic. I think we need to be less apathetic. I think we need to understand how to fight back on these issues in a peaceful and constructive way.
Hmm.
And I think that awakening is happening. It just takes time to get people there, because it's very easy to throw on Netflix and chill, right? Like it's
Hmm.
easy to not to want to get involved in conflicts or be in litigation or be outspoken at a conference. The hard thing is to do something, and I think
Yep.
people are getting forced to that point now.
Well, there's two hard things. There is getting involved. Sometimes people will say, well, I just don't pay attention to politics. And I say, well, you better. You better, because it's everything. It's your health, it's your money, it's your family, it's everything. So that's the first hard step. The second hard step is, I think, what you and I have talked about. It doesn't work just to go to war. That's a thought that I have continually in my own head when I'm triggered. I'm triggered constantly. And I just keep telling myself, don't start new wars. We have to be very careful with our way with people. And in the middle of the darkness of all this, I think we needed to be angry. We needed to break out of that apathy, and we needed to be angry. But it's time for something different, because I think you're seeing what I'm seeing. It's two sides of this battle, this argument, this divide, and they're both acting kind of crazy. And with social media and these algorithms, it's becoming more and more impossible for these two sides to talk to one another. I looked at a tweet today, and with the first sentence, I thought it was going to be a reasonable tweet. It said, "There are so many moderate Canadians who are conservative. How does it feel knowing that you support a mega Trump supporter like Poilievre?" And I thought, like, give an example. But people will see something like that, it'll just cause rage in them, and then they'll say something equally as stupid.
Mhm.
And it gets us absolutely nowhere. Absolutely nowhere.
Well, so it gets us nowhere. I agree. As a society, it gets the posters everywhere they want to be, right?
Yeah.
So part of it, look, when you look at freedom of speech or fundamental rights, those exist. They don't exist in a vacuum. They have to exist in a very broad way. And a lot of times people are equating likes and retweets or followers or whatever to self-value and popularity. And
Hmm.
what they don't get is that they're just speaking into an echo chamber of whatever they believe, and they're people who are liking it believe the same thing. And then you create this entirely diametrically opposed other side, the other, and the other you hate, and the other hates you. Well, when you stand on two opposite sides of the street and yell at each other, there's nothing that's going to happen, right? This gives the door for the government to pass the Online Harms Act to say, well, we have to censor online speech,
Yeah.
right? Because it's unsafe. Look at how violent and how crazy these comments are, and the anonymity of the internet is a perfect storm of that, right? I mean, you know, I've seen people rage tweet or get rage clicks or do stories just for the sensationalism. I mean, they claim they're free speech activists. They're not. They're doing things to get clicks and get more followers.
Yep.
But then when you meet these people, they don't dare say those same types of things, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what we've seemed to have lost. There's this pseudo identity online that is allowed to just be openly hateful and go. And I think, hey, look, if that's what you want to do it. I again, as a free speech absolutist, I support your right to do it. I may completely detest what you're saying, but it's your right to say it, and it's my right to click mute or not to read it or whatever I have to do to deal with how I feel about it. But
Mm.
what it's leading to now is censorship, right? Because both sides now are calling for that censorship, right? Both
Yeah.
sides are saying, I feel unsafe and I want the government to do something. And that's where you open the door to allowing those free speech rights to go away. It's chaotic. It's designed, in my view, and again, I don't know crap about crap. I mean, I'm just a lawyer, but in my view, a lot of this division is manufactured, right?
Hmm.
Because if you're united as a populace, if you're standing together as a majority, it's very difficult to divide, right? Like I tell my kids this all the time. I mean, they're all 18 months apart. I have three kids. And I always say, there's three of you, you'll be fine, right? Like if you stick together, it's really difficult to bully one of you, right? That there's three of you there, help each other out. When you
Hmm.
divide people, it's really easy to take them over, right? It's really easy to take away their rights. It's really easy to impose an agenda. And so you look at everything that's going on out there, right? So first you had COVID, right? You think whatever my feelings are on the prime minister, but the prime minister said, this is what was he characterizing them as? A fringe minority, right? Very divisive comments. This is a pandemic of the unvaccinated. Don't think you can go on trains or planes. Very divisive language. What did that do? It divided Canadians. Now they're fighting each other, and the government kind of slides through that middle, right? You look at Ukraine, Russia, same thing, right? We needed something new. Immediately, COVID seems to have stopped, and now we're into a global conflict that has really catastrophic potentials, and you have to pick a side, right? So I remember everyone had in their Twitter bios either a Ukraine flag or a Russian flag, and this is the sides we're picking. Okay, so now you're on a different side of that, and that was all about Twitter. And then that started calming down. Well, now we're going to Israel and Palestine, and everyone pick a side there. And again, people are rage tweeting in one thing or another thing. They're assaulting Jewish people, they're assaulting Muslim people, they're assaulting Christian people. And you go, what the hell is this? Right? You're all Canadian, or you're all in the US or whatever country you're in. How are you taking these diametrically opposed sides and then fighting each other? And who's benefiting? You're not, right? You're standing on one side of the street and the other party's on the other side, and you're yelling. Okay, I hope you feel better. Nobody's benefiting from that.
Nobody.
But the government is, right? The people who want you distracted and want that control benefit greatly from causing that divide. And I think that people need to, or at least start to wake up to that reality that maybe a lot of this hate is manufactured and implanted into who we are. And if we can get out of that discourse, then maybe we can make some progress. But as long as we're there, we're not going anywhere. We're going to continue. After Israel, Palestine, there will be something else. Maybe it'll be China, Taiwan. Who knows? There'll be something else that will be the new soup of the day that you're supposed to fight with your neighbor about. And that's really the issue.
I won't go deep into the Middle East war right now, but the one thing that I thought of when that happened, with everybody rising up to the cause, was there are other wars happening right now. There are genocides happening in other countries. Look at the horrible things that are happening in China. Where were those people then? So just watching how everyone's attention can be funneled in a particular direction. And it's not to say that you shouldn't care about what's happening in the Middle East right now. I just found it very interesting how easy it was, like you said, to shift everyone's attention from COVID, and then we're all going to care about Ukraine now, and then this one single solitary issue. And that fracturing seems to happen mostly on the right. The left seems very good at sticking together and unifying around an issue, and maybe that's because of some of the more totalitarian cancel culture practices. But that the latest war really fractured people on the right, especially. And the war is real. That's actually obviously happening. But when I saw people just at each other's throat over that, I just thought, did you not learn anything from the last 4 years? Did you not learn anything? Like, we kind of figured out for a very brief moment that, like you said, there's three of you. If you guys stick together, we can solve some problems. And everyone just exploded and fell apart.
Yeah, I mean, look, it was part of my talk at the We Unify conference on the issue of how things like the Online Harms Act get passed. I mean, you're talking to a room full of folks who I'm assuming here, but it's a pretty logical assumption, supported the trucker convoy and supported the quote freedom movement, whatever that was or is in its various forms. And yet during the break, there was a protest going on outside. There were two protests, right? There was one, as you remember, with the transgender rights protest, which mistakenly thought that this conference had something to do with transgender rights. It didn't. So it was completely separate issues. However, they were protesting, and I saw a lot of people angry at them and their right to protest and putting cameras in their faces. And I said to myself, why are you doing that? Right. And then there was a Palestinian protest going on downtown on the state. It was a very busy day in Victoria for protests. And you saw a lot of people angry. Well, look at them and they're protesting. Well, again, you're either a rights absolutist or you're not, right? So
Yes.
if you believe that the trucker convoy had the right to be there, then so did the transgender protesters, so did the Palestinian protesters, so did the Jewish protesters. They have the right to be there. In fact,
Mm-hmm.
if you're actually trying to make things better, you don't have to agree with anything anybody else says, but you should fight for their right to say it.
Mm-hmm.
And so you should also fight for their right to protest it, not try and shut them down. And I think that's the biggest thing I took away was I'm starting to see this shift. And like you said, this fracture on the right, the Middle East one seems to be the biggest one that's caused that, or at least the most evident one.
Mm-hmm.
But you have now within the right different factions and people supporting X and Y. And oh, you're a Palestinian, you shouldn't get the right to protest, right? Like there's a lot of ridiculous things, but there's a lot of people making a lot of money off of that, right? And that's, I think, what this movement or any discourse needs to understand: who's getting rich and why.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of people making money on demonizing others who are exercising their constitutional rights, and yet they say they stand for constitutional rights. It's oxymoronic, it's illogical, and anybody who takes a close look should be able to say, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. Again, you don't have to agree with what they say. You don't have to stand for what they stand for. No one's telling you that. But if you're demonizing them and trying to take away their rights, and then the government says, we're going to pass a law that helps you with that issue, and you say great, and we cheer and usher in the reduction of our rights to free speech or assembly, then the next time you want to do a trucker convoy or any other protest, that law is
Mm-hmm.
going to be applied to you. And yet the tunnel vision doesn't allow you to see that, right? So
Yeah.
I think it's a bit silly what's happening with some of this stuff, but it's the world we're in, I guess.
Well, Joe Rogan said the other day that people are just really short-sighted. They are celebrating certain laws because it benefits them in that moment, not thinking of where that can go in the future. So, the censorship law, for example, if you are on the left right now, you might feel really good about the idea that everyone on the right might be censored. Well, what happens when the government that you don't support now has that power and you are completely censored? Do you still like that? And that's what I mean by short-sighted. It's a power that no one should have. What are your biggest concerns about this bill? And do you think there's a likelihood that it's going to pass and go through?
Yeah, so it's Bill C-63. It's in the process of passing right now, so it's going through various committees federally. I think it will pass. I have significant concerns personally about what that means. So maybe some historical context, right? So traditionally, there have been limits on free speech, but those limits are confined to inciting violence, right? So being in a populous center or somewhere where violence is likely to occur by you inciting it, go get that person, go kill so and so. That was limited. And then speech around pedophilia and inciting that stuff was limited. Going into a theater, a crowded theater, and yelling fire, there's a limitation there because you're putting others in danger potentially over that. So there were these long-standing developed limitations to speech, right? They were demonstrably justified, and you said, okay, well, if I go into the middle of a field with nobody there and I say, go kill so and so, that's actually not inciting violence. If I'm in the middle of a city center doing it and so is around, right, the more logical it becomes that it can actually happen, the harm that you're inciting, the more that speech is considered out of bounds.
Mhm.
So even those limits had those kind of nuances on it. So now what we're saying through Bill C-63 is first we're couching it all in terms of child safety, which is a universal truth that no one disagrees with, at least no one I know. We don't want child pornography, we don't want pedophilia, we don't want online bullying for children. So that's how it's couched and framed, right? Why we need to have this type of control over internet service providers so we can get this information on who's doing it. Okay. But then there's the act starts to become a bit more nebulous, right? So one of the things in the act that it says is that you could be in violation of this act if you foment hatred. I have no idea what that means, right? Like the last time I heard the words foment was actually in an Office episode between Dwight Schrute and Jim, with Jim, it was bugging Dwight about fomenting an office insurrection at the time. So it was a comedic term. Like it was never to me like a real thing, but apparently it's a real thing. And so foment hatred. Well, does that mean I can like a tweet? Am I fomenting hatred? Am I retweeting? Does that foment it? What if I post something that says, from the river to the sea, fine, whether you believe in that or not. What if I said that? Is that fomenting hatred towards Jewish people? And what if a Jewish person posted the exact same thing from the Likud party charter and said from the river to the sea? Are they fomenting hatred against Palestinian people? I don't know. And that's the problem, is that it's so nebulous when it comes to what the government can decide is hate speech and what fomenting hatred means, that there are no rules. It's not defined yet in the act. There's an independent commission set up, the Data Safety Office, and an ombudsperson who's appointed by the government of the day and serves at the pleasure of that government. So they're not, they don't survive the government. They serve at the pleasure of the government. And they decide, right, what this speech is. So that's a huge concern of mine, because now you can go to the internet service provider. You don't have to produce a warrant. Well, now when this passes, you don't have to produce a warrant. You can get user data. You can get home IP addresses. So even these people out there that post from these weird pseudonyms and think they're immune and they can be keyboard, bullies or warriors, they're all in trouble, right? Like they can get all of who you are very, very quickly. And even a VPN, I don't think prevents that when you're connected to home internet. Like there is a way for them to get that information. So that's a bit of an issue, or a significant issue. The other significant issue that pops up around this act is this whole notion of pre-crime, which is right out of Minority Report, right? And this whole notion that you haven't yet done something, but I can go to court and say, Carla's about to do hate speech or about to do something that's against this act, and I can get an order preventing Carla from even doing, and potentially sanctions against Carla. Yeah, Carla hasn't actually done anything yet. But I presented a reasonable argument that she was about to, right? She's going to record this podcast at noon. It's coming out. She's tweeted about it. So that stuff really makes a very difficult legal analysis when you look at that act and you go, well, how does that comport with due process? How does it comport with understanding what laws you're violating? And really, it's a way for the government to control social media platforms, control freedom of expression, and of course, all of the other goals that they have around child pornography and online bullying, which I would argue that is being controlled now, or at least should be being controlled based on the current laws on the books and the current terms of service for X and Facebook and Instagram and everybody else. They also do a sweep for that stuff and delete it and report it to the authorities. So I think it's overbroad. I think it's quite dangerous, and I think it could lead to a scenario where we have a lot less freedoms. And again, in the apathetic country that we're the first place really to get this. I don't think we're going to be the last. I think the US has been flirting with this for a long time. The UK, I think, has some version of this that's either in progress or has just recently passed. And so we'll see more and more of that. And the less discourse you can have and more fed by your media or your own echo chamber narrative, the more you'll be able to be controlled. So that's my concern.
Those people that I mentioned that say that they don't like paying attention to politics, I always drop the pre-crime bill. Like, are you aware? Even if that didn't pass, the fact that they would even try and put that into a bill is very 1984. It's horrific how that doesn't just snap everybody awake right now. I don't know.
Well, it's also not being challenged, right? So, and again, I don't speak for the Conservative Party or claim to know everything that they're doing, but from what I've seen thus far, I haven't seen significant pushback from the opposition to say when we come in power, we're going to scrap this thing. Maybe they have, but I certainly haven't seen it. And my experience with any governments that come and go is that once power is attained, it's very rarely given back.
Yeah.
And so, if this is going to be passed, I don't know if a conservative government would undo it, because again, it's a narrative issue, right? The whole 90% of the way that act is written, it's written around child safety. And so it becomes very much of a narrative issue. And I don't know if any government's going to undo it. I certainly think it will be passed. And I think that over time, I mean, they don't smash you over the head right away, right? Even if they pass it tomorrow, we won't see a shutdown of speech, but over time you will, right? You'll start to see more and more of that shutdown. And so, yeah, I mean, the US has a piece of legislation that was passed by the House, legislation on anti-Semitism, that essentially farmed out the definition of anti-Semitism to a third-party website. And there were parts of the Bible that a Christian Congress passed, that would become illegal under that act, right? Because the Bible talks about Jesus and what happened to him and in Israel and all of that. Well, that could be considered anti-Semitic, right? And so they haven't fully passed that act yet. So, and I don't purport to know everything in it, but you start to have to understand that this is being cheered for by people. And so once these things do pass, it's very difficult to undo.
Are you at risk at all by challenging the federal government, by challenging these kind of rules? So, like in the last 4 years, we saw doctors who never thought that their ability to doctor would be taken away. We
Mm.
have media personnel who never thought that they'd have to watch what they said for fear of going to jail. Do you ever fear that you won't be able to practice law in certain areas, that there at some point will be some sort of restriction on you, that you're not allowed to have these kind of cases? Or do you feel pretty free in your profession?
Yeah, I mean, look, especially early on in the COVID fights, there weren't many lawyers doing it, and it was somewhat isolated. The experienced lawyers out there and the firms, various firms around the country, they understand that you're just taking a case. You're a tool in the tool shed. It's not your case. You're taking up a client's matter, and you have every right to take it.
Mhm.
Lawyers defend criminals, they defend mass murderers, they defend serial killers, they defend pedophiles. So for the longest time, I mean, lawyers have had a job to do, and you're doing your job. There is a movement now to have more government oversight over the profession, which is currently being challenged in British Columbia. Now, whether or not that oversight would result in a limitation on the types of cases you can do, I don't know. I don't think so. And simply because these judges have been lawyers themselves, and you start to understand that if all of a sudden there are certain types of people that can't be represented,
Mhm.
or certain types of cases that can't go, then what's the point of anything that we do? So I don't know if that will happen. I mean, I've been audited lots by the federal government. I've been audited by the law societies. I've kind of had some degree of new things happen, but for the most part, I think I'm free to take the cases, and the only limitation we have is how many we can take on, how many we can fund, and as long as we're able to do it, we're going to do it.
So I haven't looked at your Wikipedia page, but I'm not sure if
I
anyone's
don't
been coming
have one.
after you yet.
No, I don't have a Wikipedia page, and I don't really do interviews. So
Mhm.
so I don't think, I mean, I'm sure there's lots to come after me for, but I generally take a very reasoned position. And if
Mhm.
somebody wants to debate an issue, I'm sure we can, but I'm not out there. Like, I don't think the courts are corrupt. I didn't think that the Nuremberg trials should come to Canada. Like, there are various things even within the movements or what people say that I just disagree with, right? I mean, I think
Mhm.
that there is a rational way, well, what I believe is a rational way to do what we're doing. Um, I hope we can do it. One day these cases will end, and maybe we'll be on to the next set of issues with our fundamental freedoms. But, for now, this is what we do. And yeah, I don't have a Wikipedia page. I don't think anybody's taken the time to write one. I don't think they should either. It's probably one of the most boring things you can do. But we do have a website that you can see my
Mhm.
bio on if you want.
I mean, I think we have to stay reasonable and stay hopeful. It, I get people in my world and my community sometimes that they send me messages like it doesn't matter if you vote. They're a uniparty. Everything is corrupt. The courts are corrupt. And the only thing I say is, how is that working for you? Believing that things are totally hopeless, that nothing you do matters. Even if I'm wrong, and that actually is the case, I'm choosing not to go there. I'm choosing not to be blackpilled because I lose. Like, at least when you have hope, it gives you the motivation to keep moving forward. Instead of worrying about things, you're taking action. You're actually doing something about it instead. And I'm just not of the belief that everything is out of our hands, that everything is going down the drain, like everything is hopeless. Like, not at all. I think that's a miserable place to live. So I really appreciate that you're just keeping the moderate approach here. And that kind of leads to my last question here. You have some huge cases coming up that for a lot of people they probably wouldn't even try because they're so big. You're up against giants. What gives you the motivation to keep going?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I've always had a degree um, of stupidity that I've kind of internalized. You know, look, I was raised in Ontario housing, which was a socially welfare housing project in Toronto. My parents were blue collar workers. They grew up, you know, one was driving a cab, one was working in a factory. And you know, I fought and built everything I have today. Parents were amazing, are amazing. My mom's still around, but part of it was there was adversity all the time, right? So when I was in grade school, I was being told at that time, you know, you should be a legal assistant. Don't set your sights on lawyer. And there was gang fights and there was arrests and there was all of these different adverse factors. There was money issues, and you just kind of say, okay, well, how do I build my constitution to persevere? How do I keep going? And I just did that, right? I mean, I went to university. You know, people said from there, oh, you're not going to get into law school. Well, okay, let's see. Got into law school, and people said, well, you know, you can't go to a U.S. law school and do well. Well, I did. And then came to Canada and they said, oh, you can't get articles. Well, I became general counsel of the nurses union. And I said, oh, you can't be a CEO. Well, I became the CEO. Oh, you can't be on these national boards with these, you know, heads of banks and other people. Well, I was the youngest person appointed to that board. So, you know, you just, there's been this constant pushback of adversity. I think I've been naturally trained in it, where a million people tell you what you can't do. It's too big, it's too dangerous, there's too much work involved, you can't do it. And I just say hogwash. Like, absolutely you
Mhm.
can. I think anybody can. You just have to set your mind to it. I don't care how big my opponent is. I've had bigger opponents, and I've been fighting governments for years. Sure, right? You can be Pfizer, you have billions of dollars. Okay, but at a certain point, the rubber's going to meet the road. You're going to have to produce evidence. You're going to have to respond to my evidence, and we'll just keep going. And you'll keep going, and eventually we'll get a decision. So I think that's kind of how I was raised, and who I am as a person. I get to now live in my home that overlooks the ocean, very similar to you in Kenora, and or, sorry, I shouldn't have said where you live, but you know, very similar to you, overlooking the ocean.
Mhm.
And I built that, and so yeah, I'm just gonna keep going and do my thing. But yeah, that's probably what it is. I think most
Mhm.
people would prefer that I stopped at times, but there's no off button.
Your family, they supportive of what you do?
Yeah, I mean, I don't get to spend as much time with them as I'd like. I go 7 days a week. Um, it is a lot to get done, but you know, we make the pilgrimage to Costco at least once every couple of weeks, and go and spend that crazy amount of money. But yeah, you know, I try and see them when I can, and you know, they're also growing and busy professionals and busy people. So I think, you know, that's there, but right now my focus is on, I'd like to build this firm. I'd like to fight as much as we can to vindicate these rights. When I take on a case like the Pfizer case with Dan Hartman, that it means a lot. Like, it's not just another case to me, right? And like Sheila Lewis wasn't just another case to me. These are people who have died or were dying. Their lives are on the line. This is a young kid who died on September 27th of 2001. I was born on September 27th. That's actually my birthday. And so there's so many weird coincidences when that case hit me where I was like, okay, let's fight this. So I do it, it's not about money. It's about, this is what I believe in. And there is an opponent, but any opponent that I have faced before has always gotten knocked down, and they've always kind of not understood how that happens. And I think part of that is learning how to fight, how to there's this great quote that I often say, right, where I say we have come too far. We have struggled too much to let go of everything we have without a fight. And we, our friends, have not forgotten how to fight. And so, I live by that, and hopefully make a better world for my kids. And that's all we can do.
I love that. Well, keep us updated. I know these things take a whole lot of time, but I'm looking forward to just watching how all these things materialize. Really appreciate your time here today.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure. Thanks, Carla.
Thanks for coming. We'll have to bring you on part 2 when you're kicking ass with these cases.
Yeah, absolutely. You'll get the exclusive. Don't worry.
Awesome. Thank you, Omar.
All right. Take care.
Been underground, now I aim for the sky. Don't quit now, you can last longer. All these wounds only making you stronger. Don't